Well, why don't I read the write-up just to set the tone? My plot has been framed. Frame stories and how to make them work for you. From Frankenstein to Harry Potter, literature is full of frame stories where one narrative nests inside another one. What are some of the advantages of this unique storytelling device, and how can you use it to best advantage? Our panelists discuss their own use of frame stories and the best examples from books to both commentary and classic, contemporary and classic. Okay, that makes more sense. Okay, JD, I'm thoroughly unqualified to be on this panel because I always just thought that they were subplots. But
it depends on how it's used. I mean, I think there is, by the way, I'm JD DeLuzio, author of a few books and some others coming out. And I happened to notice from a photo texted to me that you can find The Con, which is set at a convention, and Live Nude Aliens and Other Stories actually at the Indianapolis Convention, right alongside Stephen Pearl's books, or many of Stephen's books. I guess it depends. We should think about defining a framing story. Because, you've got the classic framing story. I believe the description gives the example of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where somebody sails out, Robert Walton, I think his name is, and he finds Victor Frankenstein, who then tells the story, and Robert Walton's story frames Frankenstein. The story that Frankenstein's telling. So it's one kind of framing story. You've also got, I don't know if you want to call it a framing story, but it's kind of a framing story where there's a fictional context in which the story exists, a fictional frame. And that's a kind of framing story. I'm thinking of a very charming kids science fiction novel from the 60s called The Pushcart War. And there isn't per se a framing story, but there is insofar that the book is allegedly a child-friendly account of the Pushcart War. And when it was originally published in 1964, the book was supposedly published in the 80s. So it was someone in an imaginary future world of the 80s writing about events that supposedly happened in the 70s. But it was written in 64. And it constantly references its imaginary sources for writing with the Pushcart War. The version I read was updated to 1986. The events happened in 86, but the book was supposedly published in the 90s. But since I read it as an adult, I always imagined that it just happened in some alternate 1980s. But that's a kind of framing story. It's different from the kind of framing story where that you'd get with Frankenstein, where there's one clear framing. So that's more framing context. But either case, your story is being filtered through something else. And I think that can add a whole other level separate of a subplot. And it can raise a lot of really interesting questions.
Okay, now that you explain it, I actually have used the device. I just didn't have the proper label for it. Because in the Freedom Saga, Cloning Freedoms, Freedom's Law, and in December, Freedom's Myth, and a year after that, Arming Freedom, and then Freedom's War a year after that, hopefully. I have the clones are used to make full VR5 plus emotion entertainments, and they live in the set region, which emulates the early 21st century, and are manipulated to produce the various dramas that the controllers want to send to market. And as such, any of the events happening in the set region really can be viewed as a framed story, because you have the larger universe outside of the set region. So they have one of the shows, Angel Black, is the story of a group of genetically enhanced human beings who are fighting to stop a group of alien pirates from taking over the world. So yes, it's a completely framed story by your standards, by your definition.
Yeah, and I think most writers, many writers use it, and of course, it's also connected to reliability of narrators as well, even though it's a slightly different technique. I guess the first question is for both of us, but Stephen, why frame? What do you see as some of the benefits of framing a story with this other story that you've also made up?
Well, frankly, it was a mechanical thing. Slavery in a high-tech society is ridiculous. Machines do it better, and including Lubabots. But anyway, machines do it better. So slavery in a futuristic setting, you have to really engineer something that the human slave can do that the machine can't. And the emotional context and emotional inputs to make the e-entertainments was that necessitated having this subclass of humans that allowed me to drive my other story factors. So it was a very mechanical plot point. But it also has the advantage that I can play out these adventures and then have the character step back from it. And part of the storyline is the gladiators, as it were, discovering what's going on and beginning to mount a revolution. And I can explore a lot of humanity from this third-party perspective. And it lets me break the first-party, third-party law whenever I please.
Yeah, to use two very famous examples and one perhaps less well-known example, sometimes it's because of a service to a greater context. The first Captain America movie for the Marvel Cinematic Universe used the framing device of finding Captain America in the present because they wanted to have this 1940s story, but they wanted to connect it to their interconnected universe. And by framing it that way, it really didn't serve any other purpose except to put Captain America into the present so that the next movie and the Avengers movie could show us a present tense Captain America and show us how he got there. There are all kinds of articles and scholarly papers onto why Mary Shelley might have framed Frankenstein with Robert Walton's journey. But you get this very interesting thing. You get a couple of interesting things. One is you've got this remove. Did this fantastic story really happen? Or is, because it's somebody telling you a story someone else told you. But there's also the fact that I think anyone reading Frankenstein at the time would have seen it as a pretty fantastic story, as science fiction is, that's commenting on real world things. And Shelley framed this story about the scientist who goes too far, who meddles in things that perhaps we should leave alone, or things that are going to have repercussions we do not understand. With real life exploration, Robert Walton is pushing the bounds of exploration into the Arctic. That was kind of happening with Europeans in that era. They were pushing the bounds into parts of the world that Europeans did not know. And so the story of Victor Frankenstein creating a man which has all kinds of negative consequences is framed by the story of another man and his crew perhaps doing something that's going to have consequences in the future that in at that time in history we did not grasp. And I think we can all look back and say that the European push to explore in that era had some consequences that perhaps have not been consistently good consequences and have shaped the world. On the other hand, you can do something like in the Live Nude Aliens actually has a story called Live Nude Aliens. It's framed by a story of some people who end up in a bar telling stories, and this one guy's really distraught, and he's also really inebriated, and he kind of makes a sort of a Chaucer type bet, Canterbury Tales type bet, where he says, well, we'll all tell a story, and whoever has the best story gets their dinner provided for them, because he wants to tell them his story. And that already makes his story suspect. Did it really happen to him? Or is he making it up? But what you get is him telling this science fiction story, which is being critiqued by the other two people. They don't find it very plausible. They're doing what nerds do when we watch a movie or a TV show. Well, that wouldn't happen. Well, the technology wouldn't work that way. Well, how does Superman fly? You know, it's well, wait a minute. What kind of evolution would have produced an organism like that? So they're critiquing a story, and it becomes a commentary on storytelling, particularly storytelling in the context of science fiction and fantasy, whose audiences, let's be honest here, can pick at a lot of details, because they often come from a place of a certain personality type and knowledge, education. If you're reading a science fiction, something that's claiming to be hard science fiction, you're going to get an audience who actually has some idea of how the technology would or would not work. So it became a way to comment on the fact of storytelling itself. So I don't think framing has one purpose. I think it has a range of purposes.
One of the great things with framing is backstory.
You still there?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I was letting you go.
Oh, go ahead.
But one of the great things with framing is backstory. And again, now that I'm educated as to exactly what it means, in The Light Between Stars, I have a story, and you have one too. My story is Tinker's, well, what was it? Tinker's Toxin. That's it. But I have one section where they're sitting in the Tinker wagon. It's a post-apocalyptic world, and a working television is tantamount to a miracle. But the Tinkers are technologists, and he has one in his wagon, and he's using it to put the moves on a very attractive woman. And the show comes on, and the show is produced by one of the technologically advanced states called Tinker's Road. And it gives the song, Tinkers can, oh, Tinkers can, wandering the roads, a lethal shot, a healing hand, an engineer who roams, light the way the Tinkers can in a darksome land, restore us to our squandered past, yes, the Tinkers can. And it goes on a little bit more. But basically, by framing that television show into the story overall, I was able to give a huge amount of background like that. And so what I had established what it took me the entirety of the first book to establish, I pretty much was able to give in a half a page. So, you know, it's useful as a tool for that kind of exposition.
I was just thinking Robert Charles Wilson's Gillian Comstock. I mentioned it in other panels, but I hope there's someone driving in the laneway behind, so I hope that noise isn't bothering anyone. What the heck is that? The lane's not that big. Okay. Gillian Comstock has a kind of framing story, sort of, insofar that it is supposedly being told by a character who acknowledges that he might be, well, he acknowledges that he is telling the story in a way that's basically truthful, but he acknowledges that, well, I exaggerated a few things to make it more exciting. And I think that gave, I did two things. First of all, it gave Wilson a lot of freedom to tell the story in a way that maybe at sometimes strained credibility. But if you didn't quite buy something, it was exciting. And that's the way he's telling the story, because he admits that he's stretching the truth. Huckleberry Finn does the same thing, or makes the same comment about Tom Sawyer. But of course, it also allows the reader a different insight. And I know we're getting more into narrative perspective than framing story, because the narrator is very good at telling stories, but he's a little bit clueless about things. And there's a great deal that the reader discovers that the narrator is missing, that would have to be presented if there were not that framing device, let us call it, of the narrator telling things, and a good deal of humor at the expense of the narrator, insofar that the hero of the story, Julian, is obviously gay, but this is a very religious culture, so he can't openly say that, and the narrator is completely oblivious to this. And so he comments on things that would just be narrated in a straightforward manner. And we realized, no, that's not why he's going there. You're completely misunderstanding him. And he's simply not capable of understanding that the brave and brilliant hero of the novel, it might also like men sexually. It just, because of his religious background, he just can't grasp that. But we do. And it's kind of a little extra level of the text that, we see aspects of Julian's personal life that would simply have had to have been narrated. And because we have this framing narration, that gets censored via the cluelessness of the narrator that Robert Charles Wilson has created. And it adds this kind of fun playing with both what is reality, but also acknowledging that narrators don't see everything because writers don't see everything. And that can be very interesting too. I have another example, but we should go to your question next. Or maybe the questions next, I don't know.
Well, I don't have any questions at the moment, but people should feel free to put them in. I'm monitoring. One thing I find interesting is, I don't know if you're an Anne McCaffrey fan or not, but with what was it, Morata, Dragon Lady of Pern, the What About the Plague? That is almost a framing story, but in the context of the series, because it's alluded to, it's mentioned in the earlier books in the series. And then it's written complete as a standalone book that dips out of the timeline into the past. But, there's been a buildup to it earlier in the series. And then it returns more to the Pern present. So it's kind of an interesting use of the device.
Yeah, I mean, a number of very famous novels have worked with this. We have somebody in the chat saying Mercedes Lackey's done the same throughout the Voldemort books, which I've not read. Right, interesting. Do you have a comment on that, Signata? Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, because I don't know those ones. I think providing context, I mean, probably one of the most famous framing stories in English is the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer needed a framing device to have all these different kinds of stories that run the gamut of medieval culture, late medieval culture. So, of course, you have a bunch of pilgrims going on a pilgrimage, and each of them tells a story. And that allows him to justify a wide range of stories, from very religious, and proper as the church might have seen it stories, to some obviously notoriously bawdy and rude stories, because there would be people on the pilgrimage who would tell those stories. And that it also becomes a way of examining the character of the people who would tell the various kinds of stories. And that can be very useful too. Just reading in the chat, pronounced correctly. Yeah, great. She refers often to past events in the book, then goes back and writes books about those legends. See, and now that's a very interesting way, especially in science fiction and fantasy. History is often a legend. It's often a version of history. It doesn't mean the event didn't happen, although it might have, or might not have. It's more, we have a version of the story we have created based on what we know about it. And then we're going, well, is that the real story? Or is that just somebody's framed interpretation of it? Cricket writes, read The Watchful City by S.Q. Liu. It's like reading stories of the stories that center around the main character and their reactions to the stories they're being told. That's fascinating, that idea of using the framing stories and the stories within the stories to reveal character. But it also brings into question, is this character's perspective correct? The Dracula, the Bram Stoker's Dracula, is a dossier. It's a dossier of journal entries and diary entries, and there's an early electronic recording and newspaper articles that are assembled into this dossier that reveals the story of, I guess, the Dracula incident. But some of them flatly contradict each other. And I don't know if Bram Stoker was being lazy or if that was kind of the point. Is the woman in the cemetery wearing white or black? Because the writers, that's not clear at all. What Jessica has asked, have you ever added a framing to a story after the frame story is already complete, Steve?
Actually, I do that all the time in my Chronicles of Ray McAndrews, Nuki Kubai, Revenant, and coming up Life Recount, because Ray is a wizard, but nobody has complete encyclopedic knowledge. And I always have him go back and reference the myths and legends. So I have these pre-written stories that I just have to change the verbiage on a little bit, but the conflict is there. And Ray, within the context of him trying to deal with the baddie, reads the stories about the baddie. So yeah, I do that there's a section in every book that does that. And I also tend to frame some past life regressions as part of the stories. So I have both the story that is pre-made for me, that I just have to change the verbiage a little, and the story that I'm making up, but they're both framed in the larger context of the primary adventure, which is occurring present day. So,
I don't think I've ever added it after the fact. I've sometimes added it as I was developing the piece, where I said, oh, it's far better if I tell this story this way instead of that way. But I think anytime I've used a frame, very early on in the creative process, I knew there was going to be a framing device. If you want a really interesting mass media example, a lot of you would be familiar with the episode of the original Star Trek series, The Menagerie, the two-part episode, The Menagerie. That was, of course, the original pilot of Star Trek. That was what the show was supposed to be. It was supposed to be about Christopher Pike and Number One and the science officer, Mr. Spock. And the network rejected that episode, but they had this hugely expensive episode. So when it was recast with, Kirk and Spock and so forth, they wrote an episode around that footage and created a framing story with the familiar crew of the Enterprise flashing back to the footage, which was supposedly the crew of the Enterprise before Kirk, and of course is now a series called Strange New Worlds. Cricket has asked, have you ever framed a story that has multiple points of view? I often write in anything longer than multiple points of view. The novel I'm working on right now has multiple points of view, and that's a frame of a kind. The Calm, it's not so much a framing story as it is, it's a narrative frame, in that 90% of the story is told by a character named Helfrin. And he insists on narrating events where he was not present. He claims it's because of this alien that's he has a connection to, and this allows him to tell what other people are doing. And if you believe that, and it's a science fiction novel, then he is doing that. And if you don't, then he's just making it up and doing a bit of research and guessing what the characters were doing. It calls into question what actually did happen. Some of it is verified by a secondary narrator who shows up every few chapters and it tells what she saw. But so that's kind of that. What about you, Stephen?
Actually, I was racking my brain, and in the Freedom Saga, when I have the controllers putting together the e-entertainments, I have them doing viewpoint character shifts so that you're getting the most interesting final cut. And then they do specialty cuts, which just follow one viewpoint character, but those are purchased separately, because they are the ones that, let's say you're really obsessed with one of the characters and you just want to do everything from their perspective. But the general release cut, actually, the controllers skip around as to who has the best viewpoint and the most interesting thing happening at that given moment. So yeah, I do multiple points of view, but it's explained as this is the controllers manipulating the inputs and cherry picking to make what they feel is the best stories. They're editors. You know, they're like film editors in a future technological format.
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, now I think of it, in the novel that I'm just finishing now, A Confusion of News, occasionally news articles, 3 or 4 times news articles pop up about events that have happened. It's actually quite germane to the plot that some of the events actually get reported in the news online by a character we don't otherwise know anything about, named Wendy Liu, and she's obviously a local reporter. And her account of things does not always jibe with what we've seen. That's not really a framing device, but it functions the way a framing device is to problematize what we've read. Because oftentimes the news, and I mean reporters who are really striving to get the news correctly, miss facts, get things wrong, are reporting what some witness said. Well, according to a witness, this happened. But that might not have been what actually happened, right? A lot of which gets misused as fake news in politics is just, in many cases, the reporter said, this is what this source said, right? You know, they're just another narrator trying to nail the facts. Does anyone else here, anyone in the following this panel, have a question about or a book that they've observed that has an obvious framing story? I've got a good one, but I'd be interested. I just thought of, but I'd be interested in hearing what anyone else here might have read with a really good framing story and why it might have been used. Just look up a book. Okay, I'm looking up a title. Anyone? I love The Princess Bride. Yes, everyone loved The Princess Bride. Um, it is a book, actually, Caitlin. And the book, in some ways, is a more interesting framing device than the movie, although the movie's very good too. Ooh, C.S. Lewis. The Screwtape Letters is indeed told as a found story. I mean, The Princess Bride, the framing story, among other things, becomes a device to let them get away with anything they want. And they do it in a way that's so charming. We just go along with it and we're entertained by it. Clockwork Orange, Alex is revealing what happened from the end. I think the Screwtape Letters kind of qualifies, because it's this found story of these letters and between these two characters who clearly Lewis does not expect us to trust. He even says in the introduction that not everything that these devils say should be seen as true, even from their own perspective. Don't trust them, and that gives them a kind of a get out of jail free card. If you disagree with maybe some of the theology, it's a really good example from Daniel J. Johnson. Writer named Kim Fu wrote a book a couple of years ago called, that's what I was looking up, The Lost Girls of Camp Forevermore. And it kind of has a framing story in that you've got the story of this horrible event that happened at this girls' camp in the past. And then the rest of the story is the stories of the lives of those girls after they got back from the event. That's a kind of framing story insofar that their lives has been shaped by this one event. I know I'm pushing framing story because the classic framing story is The Princess Bride, which in the movie is the grandfather telling the story to his grandson. And in the book is the author saying, well, this is an edited version of a book my dad used to tell me. And when I read the whole book, I realized a lot of it was garbage. So this is the good parts version, all the bad parts taken out. And it allows them to have even more fun in the book, including one chapter that he can't include because there's a lawsuit. And there's a little note involving the lawsuit, but of course he made up the entire story. So it's just more nonsense. It's quite entertaining. Yes, yeah, Lovecraft loves. Yeah.
Actually, a brilliant example of a framing story, and they're reissuing it this fall, apparently. Quantum Leap, the television series. Every episode was framed. And quite effectively.
Yes. I suppose that I didn't really watch it. I suppose How I Met Your Mother was framed as him telling his kids the long-winded story of how he met their mother.
Yeah.
But I never really followed it, and I'm told the story got a little out of control as the show dragged on. But again, I didn't see that, so I'm not in a position to critique it. But it does give a frame, and Quantum Leap does it too. You're part of a bigger story, and that's kind of interesting. Amanda mentions The Never-Ending Story. Cricket mentions Lovecraft, who often framed his stories with other stories. And of course, when a writer gets really famous or notorious, I suppose there's a kind of frame in that there's a discourse surrounding that writer. It's hard to approach Lovecraft now without a series of discourses about Lovecraft, framing Lovecraft. Or writers responding to Lovecraft.
Well, I read some Lovecraft quite a number of years ago now. Not really my cup of tea, but people raved about him. And I read his story, and while I was reading it, my thought was, well, this is good, but it's been so overdone. And then I looked at the publication date, and I realized he did it first, and it's been overdone because people copied it. And, you can set all the arguments about effectively him being a man of his time, and, that all the negativity that comes with that. You can set all that aside, but you've got to admit the man could write. And he had a creepy imagination.
True. Stephen King's Lovecraftian story from early in his career, Jerusalem's Lot, which is quite far removed from the TV show. Jerusalem's Lot is framed as someone finding the writings of his ancestor and reading them and dismissing them as obviously this didn't happen. This, he must have gone insane to write this. And then in the very last moment of the framing story, he makes a comment which makes us realize, it did happen, and it's about happened again to this guy who's taken possession of the house. And that's a pretty cool framing story. I know I kind of spoiled something, but I haven't told you what the story's about. And if you've read or seen the TV show, you don't know what the story's about either, because they completely changed it. Daniel J. Johnson says, a juvenile fiction story, Blue Bellet's Chasing Vermeer. The three young heroes try to solve the mystery of finding a stolen Vermeer painting, A Lady in Waiting. You get a lot of those. People find something and then try and investigate the story of it. And those can be very interesting. I'm trying to think of the name of a French movie that did that in the early 90s. And it's
there was the Blair Witch Project that did that. Most of the found footage kind of thing that they had a fad of a few years ago.
Right. And of course, it was accompanied on television when it was first released by Curse of the Blair Witch, which was a faux documentary framing parts of the movie, but not enough that we wouldn't have to see the movie, along with fake interviews and fake reports to make it look like this was actually something that had happened. Megan K. Johnson, her daughter lives here in Indy, the woman who played the Blair Witch at the end. I mean, interesting fact. Okay. So maybe they're at the convention. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, ultimately, all fiction is framed. It's framed by the narration. It's framed by the reader's expectations. The framing device is providing the writer providing an additional frame. If you read an anthology and the writer gives little introductory blurbs, that's now another frame that changes the story a bit if you read it or don't read it, which obviously would be a choice of the reader. Anyone else? Favorite frames, and why did they do them? Or why do we think we did them? Can you stump the panelists? Oh, Caitlin, from a different perspective, do you think of an example when a framing device took away from the story, or when you realized your own framing devices were getting in the way of the story? Good question. I'm not sure. Stephen?
I've edited down stories that I had framed within a story because they were becoming cumbersome. And I realized that basically every word should pull weight. And if your frame story is supposed to make 3 points, you have to really ask yourself, what is the most efficient way I can make these 3 points? And I had, in the Freedom Saga, I had a adventure going on with one of the shows in the set region. And I just reached this point with it where I said, this is becoming a story unto itself. And what is it contributing to the overall context of the book? So I basically chopped it to about 1/3 of its length, put those verbs into a file that may eventually get turned into their own story, and a story in their own right. And I'll change the names and change the setting. But so the rules for good fiction apply to a frame as much as anything else. Keep the reader engaged. Every word has to pull weight. Don't bog down. But the beauty of the, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. The beauty of the frame is that because it is framed, you can cut it off. You don't necessarily have to have a beginning, middle, end as you would in any other type of story. You can just give the climax, and as long as there's enough context for the climax to work, it's the highlight reel. It's the movie trailer. And then you can go back to the primary story.
The Illuminatus trilogy, Robert Anton Wilson, Robert Shee, and somebody else, I think. I really enjoyed the first book. It's too bad about the role that book played in convincing a whole lot of people that you know there was an evil cult called the Illuminati running the world, because of its historical antecedents to draw on. I liked the first book, but I thought its framing device of investigating it and constantly undercutting its own narrative. Oh, that's actually not what really happened. This is what really happened. Oh, hey, that's not really what happened. There's only so long I can read that before I say, I am no longer engaged in this book, because the joke was funny in the first of the 3 books. And I was not, and I really enjoyed the first book, and the other 2 kind of lost me a little bit. Yeah, The Peddler in Atlanta. There's also a movie. I noticed there's someone named X in the crowd. There's a recent horror movie called X. Came out in 2022. And there's kind of the double framing story of the because it starts and ends with the police arriving on the scene and finding the dead bodies and the evidence. And then it flashes back to the story, and then it comes full circle to them looking at the bodies. And one of the deputies, it's in Texas, so one of the sheriff's deputies coming up with I found this camera, which we know why there's a camera. He says, I wonder what we're going to find on the film. And the sheriff says something like, well, I think it's going to be one effed up horror movie. And it neither added nor took away. It was kind of a little nod to I think in its own way interesting, though not for all tastes, horror movie that has a lot of nods, to put it mildly. The writer director was very obsessed with both the history of horror movies and 70s pop culture. And it's inundated with that stuff. And there's a little nod at the end. Well, I bet you if we look at this video, we're going to see one messed up horror story or horror movie. Says it in stronger language. And that's kind of a fun framing device for what is a really disturbing and bizarre book. Oh, Megan. Oh, you mean like Romeo and Juliet that were connected to rehashing Greek old opera stories? Yeah, I would just see those as other plots, but I guess you could call them as framing devices. But Shakespeare wrote plays, so they're contextualized by the fact that they're performed on stage. And that becomes a kind of frame, and that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, a frame used by Tolkien.
Yes.
Gil-galad was an elven king, of him the harp was sadly sling, the last whose realm was fair and free between the mountains and the sea. His sword was sharp, his lance was keen, his golden shield afar was seen. But into shadow fell his star in Mordor, where the shadows are. I probably mangled that poem, but he was able to drop in history and enrich his world with just a very brief set of lines, completely in context with what the characters would actually be doing. And
contextualize,
yeah.
Megan K. Johnson had a hand up. Can Megan be unmuted?
Sure.
Oh, that was an accident. I'm sorry. I'm a theater person. I clicked the wrong button.
Okay, well,
I do
nice
it
to
all
meet
the
you,
time.
Megan. Yeah, oh boy. Yeah, this has been a couple of years of clicking the wrong button with the pandemic. So yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one because it's framed by an imaginary history, but often that is true of conventional novels. They're often framed by real history. I know we're really pushing framing device. Gee, it took place in history. Where the heck else would it take place, real or imagined? But sometimes the historical context is pretty important to framing the story. I mean, it's kind of hard to watch From Here to Eternity without the broader context of Pearl Harbor. So I know I'm pushing framing device, but I think it's all a frame. And I think a good writer needs to acknowledge the frame. Something I think we'll be talking about tomorrow when we do the world building panel, because if you build a world, it's partially because it provides the context, or if you pick a historical period. Ivanhoe. Ivanhoe is arguably has the framing device of Walter Scott's introduction, where he explains that, well, this is a romance, using romance in the old sense, fantasy, not in our, our character meets character and falls in love sense. And he says, he actually explains as his introduction, there are historical anomalies and errors. He said, I'm giving myself the latitude because this is a romance and not a strict historical novel. To the point where Robin Hood is a character in Ivanhoe. And he actually lists several places where he simply threw what we knew to be history out the window because it made the story more interesting. So his own introduction is in effect a framing device for, and you could dispense with it if you're just going to read Ivanhoe and say, shut up, it's just a fantasy novel set in a sort of real history. But he actually provides that frame of saying, don't read this for history, read this because it's an adventure story. It's a fun adventure story, and it's set in a real historical time period, but I fudged the facts where it was more interesting not to. And you have to go into the book understanding that in the same way that, as Daniel puts in the comments, Middle Earth is a myth for England. It's a Euro myth.
Yeah.
And that frames it.
It can be argued that Tolkien was the greatest plagiarist in history because he plagiarized Northern European mythology, but he was brilliant, and his use of language was brilliant. So, I'd never slam him. He's one of my favorite authors.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting to note that for the Bastard Prince saga, Horn of the Kraken being the first book, when I'm plugging that, I'll often say, well, it's not historically accurate. It's anthropologically accurate, because I took that Norse world and I fudged the history, but the anthropology I kept up with, which is a bit of a departure from framing, but it seemed to flow from the discussion.
Cricket mentions that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is framed by, I think it's Utterson telling the story. Eunice Hung reparts I know T.S. Eliot said it, but he probably stole it from someone else. The line, good writers borrow, great writers steal. Mm-hmm. What's the story that somebody said something witty supposedly to Oscar Wilde, and he said, I wish I had said that, and the person supposedly said, you will, Oscar. I was just going to say, it's not quite a framing device, but if you want the condensed version, because Tolkien writes long, if you want the condensed version of how brilliant Tolkien's use of language was, look up the letter that he sent to the German publisher in the 30s that his son or grandson made public from his private papers, when The Hobbit was being translated in the 30s into German. And this was going along quite nicely until the German publisher, it's the 30s, sent a letter saying, of course, we will need to finish this project. We will need proof that you are a pure Aryan. Tolkien's response is one of the most eloquent, brilliantly written FUs in the history of English. And that was the end of any hope of The Hobbit being translated into German until, after 1945. Read that, because it shows what a master of language Tolkien was, and a master of nuance and tone. And it's utterly brilliant. Anybody could say, yeah, F you, I'm not going to tell you that. It takes a master of language to say it in such utterly brilliant language. Megan K. Johnson, fantasy can be a bit ungrounding, surreal, and scary. So yeah, sometimes having a familiar story within an unfamiliar story helps the plot twist be grounded in something familiar that we all relate to, while leaving a psychological safety net. That's an excellent point. Yeah, I think often when my science fiction is often from the ground up. Fantastic things are happening, but we're getting a very ordinary person on the ground take on the fantastic thing. And I think, well, you said that wonderfully, Megan. Anyone else? Because I know we're running out of time and you guys have other panels and things to go to.
I will mention the, we have a break because nobody wanted to do the reading slot. At 7 o'clock, the Brain Lag stream will do the role of speculative fiction and RPG in education and warning. And myself and Ira Naiman will be on that. And after that, I'm doing a reading from Revenant, Book 2 of the Chronicles of Ray McAndrews. And that will be it for the Friday.
I don't know, you'll be at that reading, I hope. Yeah, I've got some panels tomorrow, I believe, with Stephen, one on world building and one on alien building. And I've got a reading at 3:15 or 4:15 or something tomorrow. And I actually don't know what I'm reading. 4:15 I read. Yeah. Actually, tomorrow's going to be fun because I'm at another online event too. So I'm jumping in and out of two online events, and that's my framing device for tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, for stopping by.
Yeah, at 1 o'clock, you're building better life forms for books and games. And you're reading, 4:15. And yes, you are on world building at 5.
Okay, we're looking forward. And we both have books published with Brain Lag, so we do encourage you, as have many other great writers, so do encourage you to check out their booth, along with all the other exciting things happening in Indianapolis.
Yes, and towards the top of the chat, I have my links, and Brain Lag is one of them. So you can go and check it out online if you like.
Enjoy the convention, everyone.
Bye-bye.